Hi there, and welcome to the Bible, My Cats and I. Oh my gosh, I've got the funniest story to tell you today about my cats. Something that happened this last week. See, our cats just turned a year old, and they've been sitting at the window for a whole year. And my husband and I thought, oh, it would be kind of fun to take them outside so they can feel the grass and see what it's like to be outside. Well, we have those little harnesses, the little tiny harnesses that you put them on, and then you can connect a leash to them. So we got Zoe into her harness, and usually when we've done this before for cats, they just sort of, curl up and roll over, and they want to get out of their harness, and they just freeze. They don't want to move. But, Zoe's being pretty cool about it, like Zoe does. And so, okay, great, let's get this one on Pangur. So we put it on Pangur and put his little leash on. They were, not really great about it, but then we took him outside. And once they were outside, they thought, hey, now, this is great. And forgot all about the fact that they had this harness on and the leash on and everything. So they walked around the lanai. And by the way, for those of you who are in the Southwest, that would be your patio. For those of you who are in the East, that would be your back porch. We call it a lanai here in Hawaii. So they were walking around the lanai, and we took them down on the grass, and they're really having a great time walking around, checking stuff out. And, yeah, this is really cool. So we thought, great, success. Our first time out was a success with the cats. Let's try it again tomorrow. So then the next day came, and we decided we would take them out. So we get their little harnesses on and put their leashes on, and we take them out. They're wandering around. Now, another thing that you have to know about living here in Hawaii is something that's very popular is raising chickens. Yes, there are a lot of just free-range chickens everywhere, all these, just running around. But we also raise chickens in the backyard. So I got six young ladies that are there for egg layers. So the cats are walking around, and we take them over to the chicken coop. And Pangur is just sitting there. He's looking. He's kind of interested. He's crouched down like he wants to pounce, but he's looking. And then Zoe comes up, and she's also just kind of really interested in what are these Godzilla birds, These are big birds, Mom and Dad. But they're really interested. And then after a while, Pangur just sort of thinks, oh, there's something else to do here in the backyard. So he turns around and starts to walk away from the chicken coop. Just at that moment, that's when Zoe decided to pounce. Now, mind you, there's a fence in between Zoe and the chickens, so she can't do anything to them. She can't harm them. But she sort of bolted at them, and so it startled the chickens. So, of course, they squawk, 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 and flew and ran away. Well, Pangur had his back to the chickens when they did that. So then he heard this big squawk and this big ruckus behind him, and he freaked. And so he's like trying to get out of his harness, and Rob, my husband, had a hold of him and actually was sort of like trying to pick him up just to hold on to him so he couldn't escape. But he managed to wiggle out of that thing. He got out of the harness, and he made a beeline back to the lanai. Well, the problem was that in between him and the part of the lanai where he wanted to be, there's a koi pond. And so he went running back to the lanai, and he got up on the edge of what he thought, I think, was just a platform. But he slipped and fell, and he ended up in the koi pond with the fish. Okay, so here's this cat swimming away. I so wish I had my camera, because I would have showed that on this video right now. But I will show you a picture of the aftermath. Here's what he looked like after we got him out. Rob fished him out. Rob was all soaking wet, and the cat was all soaking wet and smelled like wet cat and fish water combined. I mean, it was really hilarious, though. The poor little guy, he hasn't really been happy about going out since then. but at the time, it was really, really funny. And he did survive. He's just fine. There's no, like animal abuse or anything. He just got wet, and he went in there with the cat, with the fish. But we managed to get him out right away. I tell you that story to prepare you for something we're going to talk about during this lesson, and that is the story of Jonah. So Jonah, what do you think about when you hear about Jonah? Well, the fish, right? Oh, that's about everybody, just about, that's the first place that they go is, well, Jonah was swallowed by a whale or swallowed by a big fish and was in the belly of a fish for 3 days. But that's not what the story of Jonah is really about. If we really look at the story of Jonah, that is not the main point of the story, that Jonah spent 3 days in a whale. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what the real story of Jonah was about, because Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew refers to, well, he calls it the sign of Jonah. So he's referring to that story of Jonah, the prophet in the Old Testament. You can go read that at another time. By the way, it's really short. It's 4 chapters and it's a great story. All right, so we are in chapter 16. Congratulations. If you're new to us here on the Bible, My Cats and I, well, welcome. I encourage you to hit pause and read through the chapter before you come back and listen to the lesson, but that's up to you. If you've been with us for a while, wow, congratulations. You're really sticking with this and you are a person who really wants to learn a lot about the Bible. So I'm proud of you and glad you're sticking with us. We're more than halfway through the Gospel of Matthew now, so yay! All right, we're in chapter 16. At the very beginning of chapter 16, it starts out like many of the chapters in the Gospel of Matthew do, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to meet Jesus and ask him a question, really kind of challenging him with a question. They're trying to look for a way to call him out on something, or to find a weakness in his ministry, or to find a way that they can take him to be crucified, which is how it ends up in the end. So in this chapter, we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to Jesus. And I'm just going to be reading right here. I got my Bible right in front. You can't see it, but I got it right in front of me. So these are my only notes I got is the Bible right now. So they came to Jesus and they tested him. See, that's what I'm saying. Every time they come to him with a question, it's not really as sincere like they really want to know. They're testing him. And they are asking him to show them a sign from heaven. What are they really asking for? They want him to prove that he comes from God, right? They want a sign, meaning they want to see something miraculous right then and there. It's almost like they want him to be their cowboy. Like we're going to tell you what to do and you're going to do it just to prove to us. But Jesus, here again, he's not playing their games. He's not going to go along with that. And he replies, when evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you can't interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. And Jesus then left them and he went away. The sign of Jonah. This is sort of cryptic. What did Jesus mean by that? Now, a lot of times people jump into immediately that image that they have of Jonah that we were just talking about. Jesus being in the fish for 3 days. Jonah being in the fish for 3 days. And it sort of lines up with Jesus having spent 3 days in the grave, right? And they think that's where they immediately go. Others might interpret it as, well, if you hear the story of Jonah, it might line up with a coming judgment or something like that. Let's look at this story of Jonah. Let me tell you a little bit about it. So Jonah was considered, he's called one of the minor prophets. Has nothing to do with his importance. It has to do with the length of the book. I told you it's only 4 chapters long. So he's one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. You can go there, you can read it. And what happens is God comes to the prophet Jonah and says, I want you to go to the Ninevites. And he says, I want you to call them back to me, to faith in me. Well, who were the Ninevites? The Ninevites lived up in Assyria. And the Assyrians were the sworn enemy of Israel at the time. In fact, they were the ones that came down and captured the northern kingdom and took them away into exile. That happened first. And then Babylonia came in and conquered Assyrians, and then they came and took the southern kingdom of Israel off into exile. So I had an instructor one time in seminary who said, when you think of the Ninevites, think of like orcs, like from Tolkien, okay? That's the way the Israelites would have thought about the Ninevites. They were ugly. They were the enemy. They were the bad guys. So here's Jonah being asked by God to go to them. And what does Jonah do? He goes in completely the opposite direction. In fact, he goes to the sea. Instead of to the north, he goes to the sea, which is very unusual for an Israelite. They're not sea-bearing people. They're land people. Remember, they're people of the promised land. So he's trying to escape God. How do you escape God? How do you escape that? He's trying to escape his responsibilities to be true and obedient to God. But he goes off, and I won't go into all the details, but there is where he's on the sea, and he gets cast into the sea, and that's when the fish swallows him up, and then ends up vomiting out Jonah on land. And so Jonah survives and ends up probably tail between his legs, but he ends up going up to Nineveh. And he does bring God's message to the Ninevites that great judgment was going to come upon them unless they turned their ways and came to follow the Lord. That is important, because what happens right after that is that the Ninevites in this story listen to Jonah. And they turn and change their ways. And they do come to follow the Lord God, which was miraculous. That is the miraculous sign of Jonah. That is the sign that even people like the Ninevites can change their way. All these Gentile people who are outside of the in-group, they can turn and they can come to have faith in God and change their lives and become obedient and follow God's ways. That is the true miracle, or the sign of Jonah, is when the Ninevites turn. Okay, so keeping that in mind then, it has a lot more to do with faith and having faith in God, a growing faith, a new faith. People stepping into what they have just realized, what's been revealed to them, what they've discovered, what they've come to believe. Okay, so Jesus is saying none will be given, no miraculous sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. Interesting. Now, as we've been going along through all of these chapters, I'm trying to instill in you that you need to read everything in context, not only historical context. So we kind of did that a little bit with talking about the story of Jonah, but also the literary context. What else, what comes before and what comes after? And you can see how these chapters are not just made up of piecemeal stories that are thrown together, but they actually have a flow. So after he says that, he gets up and he leaves. That kind of takes you, that way of writing, whenever somebody moves from one location to another, it's sort of steering you into, oh, now we're going into, that's narrative art, by the way. So sort of steering you into wondering, okay, so where is he going now? What's next? So he takes his disciples and they get on a lake. They're going to cross a lake. And Jesus said, be careful. This is in verse 5. Be careful, he said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, what had happened just prior to this was we were reading about the feeding of the 5,000 people with just a couple loaves of bread. Few loaves of bread, I should say, and a couple fish. And then we were reading after that about the feeding of 4,000. So these these miraculous feedings of just using a little bit of bread. And I think maybe, the disciples' minds were still stuck on this bread stuff. And so their response was, oh, he's warning us about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He's probably saying that because we didn't bring any bread. Maybe they're wondering, is that what he's talking about? They didn't understand. So Jesus goes on to explain that what he's talking about, this yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, is actually their teaching. Beware of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We learned way back in chapter 5. Remember when we were back there? Way back in chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, how Jesus was saying, well, they're teaching you this, but I teach you this. And he took it a step beyond. He had a different twist, a different interpretation of what their teachings were. So here he's saying, be careful of their teachings. All right. Then they understood that it says here in verse, 12, that they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And immediately, now in my Bible and maybe in yours, there's like this subtitle that splits off from that last verse that I just read to, and then when Jesus came to Caesarea Philippi, this and this happened. I'd like you to, in your mind, just take that heading out, and let's just take it straight from verse 12 into verse 13. So he said, beware the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now he goes into Caesarea Philippi. Let me just tell you very briefly, Caesarea Philippi was a place where there were a lot of different gods and demigods represented. So there was that kind of a culture everywhere. And this is when Jesus turns to his disciples and says, who do people say the Son of Man is? Here are all these choices, all these different gods. Who is it that people say the Son of Man is? And they came up with different ideas. They said, well, some say John the Baptist, back from the dead, because he had already been killed. Some say Elijah. Okay, remember, people were waiting for the Elijah to come to be the precursor to the Messiah that was to come. Jesus made it clear that was John the Baptist, actually. And then still others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. So they don't point to any of the gods. They say, people are saying, we all say that, right? People are saying, I heard somebody out in the parking lot say, rather than saying, I say. Anyway, people are saying that you're one of the prophets. But then he turned and he asked, what about you? Who do you say that I am? He wants to know where they stand. And it's Peter who then comes out with his profession of faith. Remember the miraculous sign of Jonah? He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Not the son of these dead gods we see around us. You are the Son of the living God. Peter's confession of faith. And Jesus replied, blessed are you. And he calls Peter by a different name. In this gospel, he's referred to as Simon Peter up until now, Simon or Simon Peter. And he calls him by a different name, though. He uses Simon. But then he says, Simon, son of Jonah. So here we go. This is the sign of Jonah. He brings us back to what he said. Nothing is going to be given to you except for the sign of Jonah. Peter comes out with this confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Oh, again, that points us back to this must have something to do with a profession of faith after having received some special revelation of who God really is. And so he goes on and he says, this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter. This is where Jesus gives him that name, Peter. He uses in Greek the word Petros. In English we say Peter. In Greek it's Petros, which kind of means like the rock man. It definitely refers to a rock. Peter, the rock man. That's who I'm going to call you. And he says, on this rock. Now here in the Greek, that's a different word for rock. It's Petra. It's the feminine. So on this rock, I will build my church, he says. Jesus is using a play of words. I'm going to call you the rock man because on this rock, I'm going to build my church. Some people take this to mean that it's on Peter that the church will be built. But I think that Jesus is referring to something other. Otherwise, he would have said, on this Petros, I will build my church. No, he says, on this Petra. And Peter represents what? This confession of true faith. So he's saying, I'm going to call you the rock man. And on this rock, this profession of faith in me as the Christ, the Son of the living God, on that I will build my church. Wow. And here, do you know that this is the only place in the Gospels that word church is used? Because up until now, it's all been something having to do with the Jewish practices of faith, right? And the synagogue. This is another reason why I believe maybe this text was written later. I talked about that in the introduction, the very first week of Matthew, about why I think maybe this particular gospel was written a little bit later. Because here's the word, on this I will build my church. And there really wasn't a church until later. By the way, something that I talked about back then was this gospel was probably written at a time when people were having to make the choice of whether to stay a part of the synagogue or whether to step into their faith. Up until then, people could believe in Jesus as the Messiah and still be a part of the synagogue. But there came a time where you had to make a choice. You either had to stay in the synagogue or walk away from the synagogue with your faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And that's what started the church, okay? That confession of faith. So that's really important here. On this rock, the confession of faith, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will not overcome it. The gates of Hades, that's the entrance basically to death. That is a Greek way of understanding the entrance to death. Jesus may be referring right here to, my death is not going to kill this. Even if I die, this is something that has begun this faith movement into the kingdom of God. And even if I die, it's not going to stop it. Okay? A little bit later, right after that, he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, in the English, it sort of sounds like we get to have that power to claim things. You know, we see that all the time. Come on, I bind you in the name of Jesus, and expect heaven to respond to our command. But in the original language in which this was written, this has sort of a reverse sense to it. Like whatever you loose or bind has already been loosed or bound in heaven. So heaven is the initiator. And then the apostles take what heaven has initiated and pronounce that out to the people. So this is, what is it that heaven has initiated? Sending the Son of God. This is a new thing. This is a new thing that God is doing in the world. And he's establishing a new creation. This is the new covenant that we have with God. In fact, the last part of our gospel that talks, or our Bibles that talks about Jesus from the Gospels on, it's called what? The New Testament, which is another word for covenant. The new covenant. This is the new thing that God is doing. And it is all founded on our individual and corporate confessions of faith in God and what God is doing in this world. I'm going to leave you with that thought. It's a beautiful, beautiful chapter as Jesus is encouraging us in our walk of faith and how wonderful it is to believe in what God is doing in the world. That gives us energy to go out and share it with others, doesn't it? And so that's what I call you to do right now. Just step into this sign of Jonah. Step into this miracle of the profession of faith and share it with others. And at the same time, don't forget, you can comment back to me. You can share these pages, this YouTube channel with your friends. If you've found new energy, new vitality in your reading, be sure to comment and subscribe. Do all those things. I'll let you know when the next thing's coming up. With that, and with great blessings, I send you out now in your faith with peace and grace and mercy of God. God bless you.